the return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Hello, and welcome to the latest Downtown podcast, where we survey the national and international scene. Just me and Joe Phillips today. Frank Mckenna's laptop has blown up, unfortunately. And today, obviously, we'll be discussing all things Trumpian. I know people get fed up with journalists who seem to be obsessed with Trump, but in all seriousness, he covers so many important issues that affect all of our lives that we've got to look in some detail at things, particularly on the world stage with Ukraine, with Gaza, and the extraordinary claim by his Vice-President Vance that we here in Europe shouldn't be worried about the Russians and the Chinese, but we should be worried about our own democratic institutions and not being horrible to the far right. Well, I'm sure Joe will want to get her teeth into that. And then we'll also be discussing a real dip in business morale in this country following Rachel Reeves' budget. And we may even get on to the topic of bright lights on cars, which Joe and I share a passionate concern about. So lots to look forward to during this podcast. And Joe, let's begin with perhaps we can begin with Ukraine and this extraordinary position that seems to be taking place at the moment. It's almost like going back to the beginning of the 20th century when I began my journalistic career, when the empires used to sort of carve up the world, the race for Africa and all this, and, I'll have this bit and you have that bit. And the idea of sort of bypassing the Ukrainians and indeed the rest of Europe for the Russians and the United States to be sort of sorting out what's going to happen in Ukraine, quite apart from the fact that it's brought Vladimir Putin back onto the center stage, back as a credible leader in the world rather than a pariah. Give us your thoughts on the situation, particularly in relation to Ukraine.
Well, first of all, you don't have to go back that far, Jim. If you remember, Yugoslavia, as it then was, being divvied up, as is recorded in my old boss Paddy Ashdown's diaries, and we spent a lot of time in Bosnia, but those are stories for another day. But carved up on a serviette at a dinner somewhere, and eventually that was sorted out. But so Trump appears to regard the world as a giant monopoly board to play with. We've seen that with his desire to turn Gaza into no longer a desperate home for desperate people, but to turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. But as far as Ukraine, this has really set the cat amongst the pigeons, because the idea that he has been talking to Putin, and we don't know how frequently, but I would suggest more than once, and is prepared to even countenance negotiations without involving Europe or Ukraine, just beggars belief. I think there are two things here. Well, several things, actually. One is that, yes, I think everybody wants the war in Ukraine to end. And I think most people recognize that the chances of Ukraine regaining Crimea that Russia invaded in 2014 are fairly remote. And, we in Europe could look to ourselves and our consciences and say, because we didn't do anything except tut and turn the other way, we basically gave Putin a green light to go a little bit further. We also know that America, going back to JFK in the 1960s, have long complained about the disproportionate amount they contribute to NATO and therefore protecting Europe. So those two things, I think, are sort of, you can park those in the not so bonkers corner, if you like, of this argument. But I think what we're seeing is Donald Trump, who wants to get his hands on the very, very valuable rare earth minerals in Ukraine, and in return is prepared to do a deal with Putin. Now, if he is that naive that he thinks Putin will go, "Oh, Donald, thank you, that's great, we'll stop there," then he is even more frighteningly stupid than it is possible to believe. Because the idea that Putin would stop at Ukraine and not want to go a bit further. But I think the other thing, Jim, and we can talk about this more at length, the other thing that is more chilling, and it links into what you alluded to about J.D. Vance speaking in Europe at the security meeting in Munich last week, the attack on Western democracies from America, whilst they are cozying up to, the most extreme regime, they're also laying a lovely path open for China. And we know perfectly well that one of the things that might happen in any settlement that does not include Europe or Ukraine, but is knocked out by the big guys, Putin and Trump, might lead to elections in Ukraine. And guess who would be putting in their favoured candidate? I mean, I think the whole thing is actually terrifying.
It looks as if what is being negotiated is some sort of ceasefire line. And we've already heard that Sir Keir Starmer has said that he would be prepared to commit British troops there, along presumably with German and French troops. But I heard quite a leading authority on military matters this morning saying that this begs all sorts of questions because, for it to be effective, you need an awful lot of troops in place, like indeed the United States actually has in South Korea, where there's been a ceasefire since 1953. And you need an awful lot of troops to make it effective, and you need air cover, and you need to think about what happens when, and I think we discussed this on previous podcasts, when not Russian troops, of course, but Donbass irregulars masquerading as Donbass irregulars actually fire on British or German troops. What happens then? Do they just sort of report it back to some authority and nothing happens? Or do they start firing? So there's an awful lot of issues to be resolved about the actual practicalities of what a ceasefire might look like. And crucially, what security is it going to give to the poor Ukrainians in the longer term? Because, if it's a ceasefire just to allow Putin to rearm and have another go, in the current leadership in the United States, he would be successful in being able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it is about the rules of engagement, because if you go in as a peacekeeping force, then actually what you really need is the UN. And that, is what we saw in Bosnia for many, many years. And we've seen around Lebanon and the sort of borders around those parts of the Middle East and other parts of the world. But, it's the UN, which again, is in Trump's firing line, likely to come up with the stuff. And the other thing, of course, is that, as we know, defence spending in this country has been woeful, as it has across Europe. And we know from many military experts and leaders that, we haven't got the capacity and the capability, either in manpower or in equipment, to fight a war or to be involved in a war, which would then open up another flank for somebody else who wanted to do something, on a different area, for the Balkans, for instance. So I think it is very dangerous. I do, however, think that it is encouraging the way Keir Starmer has reacted. I think this could be his defining moment of leadership, actually, because he is very well placed between America, where bizarrely he seems to have a reasonable working relationship with Trump, and of course he's going out there at the end of this month, and he has a good relationship with other leaders in Europe. So he's in that good place in the middle. And I think, for all the things that you and Frank and I have criticised him for, sometimes for being a bit too loyally, not enough passion, that's absolutely what you want right now, is a cool head. And I could see quite conceivably that Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, and Keir Starmer, between them, could absolutely engage in something sensible that then Starmer puts to Trump, who of course might have moved on to something else by possibly tea time, if not next week.
But I mean, is there any hope, do you think, that he will actually listen to? I mean, I take your point about Starmer acting as this vital sort of bridge between Europe and America, but is there any indication that Trump might slow down a bit and actually listen to what Starmer's going to say? I mean, isn't he going to? I mean, just to be fair to Trump, I mean, he has got a point. I mean, Andrew Neil rather graphically said, Western Europe's been happy to sort of enjoy its social security benefits and so on, and send the United States the bill for defending ourselves. Now, it's an exaggeration, but there is an element of truth in that, and it's going to be difficult for Starmer to counter that argument, isn't it?
Well, it is, unless he comes up with, stop fannying around and actually say, no, we've already committed to 2.6. I know America wants us to do 5% of GDP on defence, but he could actually move that along a bit. The problems at home with Rachel Reeves and the budget and all the rest of it, we'll talk about that in a minute. But, you've got to find the money from somewhere. The problem is that unlike COVID, this isn't a one-off. It could go on for years and years and years. I think the only thing that would make Trump listen, and I don't pretend to be an expert on American politics and certainly not the mind of Donald Trump or Elon Musk, is if he could be persuaded that by doing a deal with Putin, he makes America vulnerable to China and other players. And I think, that's where he's only interested in America, and he's only interested in Donald Trump, and he's only interested in what he can get out of it. If Ukraine hadn't got rare earth minerals that are worth gazillions of dollars, Trump wouldn't be in the slightest bit interested. In the same way he wouldn't be interested in Gaza if he hadn't already stuck a pin in that map and said, I want to build that and turn it into very expensive real estate. So you're not dealing in the normal diplomatic circles. But I think there is a sense that I think he wants to be known as a peacekeeper. He might have got his eye on a Nobel Peace Prize. If he wants to be known for bringing peace and security, then he needs to listen to some wiser voices. But the problem is, Jim, he doesn't give a toss about Europe. And as somebody said the other day on the radio, war is God's way of telling America about geography. It doesn't affect them. But if you live in Scandinavia, this is on your news, and you are getting messages every single day about, how to prepare in the event of war. So it is much closer, and certainly to us in Northern Europe. And I think, the other thing is that we've got the German elections coming up, this week. Now, if we see further instability or the rise of the right wing in Europe, then that also makes things very, very difficult. So I think we are in very dangerous times.
You don't think, do you, that he actually would countenance and think it was in America's interest and not something that they'd have to do something about to see Russia dominating Western Europe?
Well, does he really, really, really want Russia to dominate Western Europe?
He doesn't want it, but I'm just saying I think there would be a backline where he would help us defend ourselves again. I mean, if Putin invaded the Baltic states, do you think? I mean, I'm not saying this provocatively to you. You may be right that the United States would not stir itself if the Baltic states were taken over by Russia.
I don't think they would at the moment. I don't. I think he is so isolationist and so unaware of the global implications of everything else around the world. I mean, it would be interesting, wouldn't it, to see how this would play out. Let's suppose you'd got the J.D. Vance lookalikes in Germany, in France, in Norway, in Spain, in other European countries. If you'd got a Europe that was led by people more like Viktor Orban of Hungary, for instance, would America be more willing to defend them? Or, are they just want to get property? They just want to get assets?
I think you make a very valid point that Trump doesn't seem to see the wider implications of this situation, where he's sort of looking at Greenland and Panama and Gaza and saying, oh, I'd like a bit of that. Because the Chinese will take that view very much in relation to Taiwan, for instance. What is the moral? We don't know what the military position is going to be with the United States if the Chinese attempt to invade Taiwan. But where's the moral standing of the United States? Xi Jinping is going to say, we're taking our moral position from you, that all the various territories of the world are up for grabs.
Well, and I think you've just said it, Jim. If you only see parts of the world as territories to own or to deal with. You don't see them as homelands. You don't see them as places of culture, civilization, humanity and people. You just, like I say, you see it as on a monopoly board. And I think he is very, very ignorant, and the people around him are very ignorant of there is a threat to America. There is bound to be a threat to America, not least of all from his behaviour in supporting Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, and his behaviour towards his statements towards Gaza and the Palestinians. You know, if that is not a way to stir up antagonism that may or may not lead to a terrorist threat, then I don't know quite what is.
Moving on to that, I don't quite understand what's proposed. I mean, is it suggested that the Israeli army are going to physically expel the Palestinians from Gaza? I mean, the look of this is already getting very difficult. And let me say, I have always, believed very much in Israel's right to exist, and indeed to the fact that it is entirely unacceptable. No country in the world would accept their neighbours lobbing missiles at them, and I absolutely take that on board. But I have to say, some of these hostages coming out with Jewish faces, emaciated Jewish faces coming out from Hamas is a terrible, terrible sight, and we don't want to see attempts at mass expulsion. It's completely contrary to international law. But this does seem to be the only way in which Trump is going to get his Gaza by the sea.
Yeah. And, it also gives a green light to Netanyahu. But you see, again, Jim, this, in a way, what Trump is doing, it is a wake-up call to Europe and the West, I think. And we have been very comfortable, I think, sitting around, tutting, sending out declarations of condemnation, but not actually doing anything about it. We've done nothing to stop the Israeli settlers breaking international law and going in to the West Bank and taking Palestinians' homes. We've done nothing. We've condemned it, but we've done nothing. We did nothing when Putin invaded Crimea in 2014. Now here we are 11 years on, and 3 years on from full-scale war in Ukraine. So what's next? This is a time for Europe to come together, and it is an absolutely imperative moment that if we are going to be in a position of putting our young people boots on the ground, whether they're French, German, British, or whatever, we need to be absolutely clear what we're asking them to do and for what.
Well, you refer to Europe, but of course, according to Vice-President Vance, we need to be getting our house in order because we are denying democracy. I mean, just trying to put his case, I mean, one of the things he made in his very, very surprising speech was that the people of Europe hadn't voted for mass immigration from the rest of the world, and that the governments of the Western Europe were, in a sense, denying what the people of Western Europe want, which is not to have big flows of immigration. And we needed to put our house in order. That seemed to be the thrust of his speech.
Well, that, and, apparently there's a huge curtailment of free speech in Europe. Not as much as I would suggest as there is in Russia. We are 1 year on from the death of Alexei Navalny, a brave and fantastic man who tried to fight Putin and lost and was murdered in a dreadful Russian prison. And Vance is talking without any sense of irony from a country that is banning books in public libraries and schools, is closing down arts and creative institutions and putting their own people in, is blocking funding for science and research and education and all the things that help to create and foster civilization, global cooperation, and all of those things. So, frankly, I know the normal rules don't apply, and for Trump and Vance, they think they can turn up to the Munich Security Conference and be as rude as they like. But what I find very sad is that Kemi Badenoch, talking today at some right-wing gathering in London, of right-wing leaders from around the world, is echoing what J.D. Vance says. And I know I've said this before, Jim, but where is the patriotism to stand up for this country, which actually does have a good record on free speech, but does protect people from libel, from slander, from hate speech and things like that. But, you know, what is the equivalent to the BBC? Good job Frank's not here. You know, Fox News, we've got something we can be proud of around the world. You know, what have we given, all of us in Europe, what have we given to the rest of the world? And what have we got, you know, from places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Egypt and Gaza? You know, all of those things are so important. And these men, and they are all men surrounding Trump, they are absolutely starting with no sense of history, no sense of the future, because we are caught in, and I'm sorry to use language that people might find offensive, but this is a willy waving competition and we are caught in the middle of it, and it's not very nice.
Of course, the other thing that Vance did was to talk to the AfD in Germany and not to any of the conventional politicians. And before we do our next podcast, of course, we'll have the results of the German elections. What do you think is going to happen there?
I think that they might squeak in, what's his name? Frederick.
Merz,
Merz, yeah,
the
he might
Christian
squeak
Democrat.
in,
Yeah.
but I mean, you know, it is quite clear that AfD have got support, and it is probable that Germany's lost its prime position. Its industrial base has collapsed, particularly in car manufacturing. Merkel's policy of open door to migrants in 2015 has backfired because they've got far more than they suspected. So they've got the cost of living crisis, they've got migrant numbers going through the roof, which when people are in a cost of living crisis, they look at someone else to blame. And they've got a very unstable government. So I think, you know, again, it is this sense of, where are the leaders? I mean,
you think the Christian Democrats might get in without the need to do any sort of deal at all with the far right?
It's possible. It's possible. I mean, I would like to think that there are enough people in Germany who go, okay, things are bad, but we don't want to go back to that. But I think one of the things that is interesting is if you look at the polling, and it is so clearly split between the old East Germany, who want AfD, and the West, who are much more progressive, much more liberal, if you like, centre left. And it echoes what we keep hearing in surveys and polls and anecdotes and things, that people are looking for strong leadership. And I think in a sense that's what Trump is offering. You know, he's offering, right, okay, we're going to get on with this, we're going to do this. You might not like it, but we're moving quickly. And we've seen it in that big Times survey on Gen Z, on young people, and young people saying, you know, they don't think elections are worth bothering with. They'd rather have a strong leader. You know, whether they actually really thought that if it came to somebody like Putin, it would be another kettle of fish. I think it's a level of ignorance that I find deeply depressing. But I do think, you know, that difference between when people feel fed up, and the world's been in turmoil really since 2008 with the banking crash, and then we've had COVID, and then we've had, you know, everything else going on around us. And I think people feel unsettled, they feel frightened, they feel powerless, and so they are looking to somebody who is basically echoing their opinions. Whether they're coming up with policies, well, we know that that's a question mark. But if they're coming to people because they sound like they are allowing them to say it's all the fault of migrants, then that is very dangerous. And I think that's, you know, but it's very appealing to lots of people across Europe.
Yes, and as I've said in a previous podcast, but we're not going to spend today talking about him, that Nigel Farage is in pole position to benefit from that in this country. But when we do come back after the break, I want to turn to another aspect of domestic politics, not Farage or the Conservative Party this week, but the financial situation, the position of the Chancellor, who's had a little local difficulty over her CV and expenses, but he must be even more concerned about the flatlining of business confidence. And we'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to this Frankless podcast. Frank's laptop has expired, but he hasn't. I'm sure he'll be back next week. So you landed with Joe Phillips, former press officer to the former Liberal Democrat leader Paddy Ashdown, and now a star on GB News, confronting Mr Farage every Tuesday evening, and myself, Jim Hancock, the political editor of Downtown in Business. And let's turn to domestic matters now and look at the Labour Party. I mean, obviously the ongoing embarrassment of the Shiver My Timbers, or whatever it was called,
Trigger My Timbers.
Trigger My Timbers in Tameside continues to embarrass the Labour Party, but they're also embarrassed by disclosures about the Chancellor of the Exchequer's somewhat contested CV and questions of her expenses, and of course the economy itself. But a person who's attracting particular attention is the Attorney General. And Joe, do you want to tell us what the problem is with Mr. Hermer?
Yes, well, you might call him Mr. Hermer. He's Lord Hermer.
Lord Hermer.
So he was appointed by Keir Starmer. They had worked together in law before coming into politics. Richard Hermer is not a politician. He has been a leading lawyer with some might say dubious clients. He's proving to be a bit of a problem. He's been criticised by Lord Glassman, Maurice Glassman, who's a Labour peer and part of the sort of Blue Labour group, for being the worst type of progressive sort of stick in the mud, do it all by the letter, hidebound to European human rights law and all that sort of stuff. So there's a sense that Hermer is blocking things because he wants to stick to the letter of the law. So there we have two
blocking important Labour policies. I mean, like more houses or cutting waiting lists. I don't see him blocking that.
But there are also questions about his relationship with Gerry Adams, for instance, and whether or not Gerry Adams would be entitled to compensation for wrongful imprisonment during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The bigger question, and the one that is proving a bit more sticky, I think, for the government, is Hermer's possible involvement in the Chagos deal, which is exercising an awful lot of people. Who'd have thought it, 6 months ago, nobody could have told you where Chagos Islands were. But now it's become a bit of a millstone round the government's neck. The thing is, Jim, that Keir Starmer can't afford to have another Sue Gray moment. And if he has made another political appointment of somebody who is not political and hasn't got the political antennae, who is really irritating Labour MPs and Labour ministers because of his apparent inability to see the speed at which things need to move, then I think he's got a bit of a problem. But moving on to Rachel Reeves, I wonder whether people would be so excised about her CV if the economy was doing better.
Yes, well, you're obviously referring to the fact that the latest business surveys that are coming out are saying that business confidence is probably as bad as it was almost any time back to, never mind COVID, but almost back to the financial crash of 2008. And this seems to be a combination of the living wage going up in April and, of course, the national insurance contributions. The government obviously believes they've put in place other measures to enhance business, and that they're driving forward with the green agenda, and there'll be a lot of investment like that. But do you think business is entitled to be as pessimistic as it is, or should it be showing a bit more gumption and supporting the government and getting on with the initiatives like building houses, building, to do with the green agenda? There's plenty of work out there.
Well, there's plenty of work out there, but there aren't the skilled workers to do it. I mean, we've heard people in the construction industry saying we just simply don't have the people who are trained and skilled enough to build the 1.5 million houses that the government's promised. Now, 14 years of the Tories, by now we could have had an army of highly skilled craftspeople ready to go and work on building sites and build infrastructure. And of course we don't have access anymore to the Eastern Europeans who proved so absolutely invaluable during the great building boom in London a few years back. I don't think business is wrong to feel disgruntled. Because if you're a small or medium-sized business like a pub or a hairdresser's or a local shop, you know, or any number of high street outlets, you are suddenly seeing thousands of pounds onto your outgoings. That's without the cost of power, business rates, etc., etc. And that's just to stay where you are with the number of staff you've got. And I think the underlying thing in the survey you mentioned, Jim, is not just the lack of confidence, it's the planned redundancies or the lack of hiring. Now, if that is happening in, you know, I'm talking to you from East Kent, which has got very, very high unemployment, and there are no other jobs. So, you know, you're then going to end up with people on unemployment benefit who are economically inactive. You've got businesses who are looking to shut up, you know, put the shutters up because they can't afford to stay in business. And it's very difficult to see how you come out of it because Rachel Reeves, you know, much as she might like to, you can't wish an economic boom if people are feeling the pinch. And I mean, every single person you talk to, whether it's your car insurance, your house insurance, your dentist bills, your vet's bills, all of those things, your council tax, which is just beginning to plop through the letterbox at the moment, everything is going up. And I think, you know, it's perfectly understandable. Big businesses, okay, they can absorb some of the cost, but you are seeing big layoffs and you're seeing lots of small to medium-sized businesses just shut up shop.
So do you think, it's a triple question here for you, do you think there could be a spring statement? What would be in that spring statement that wouldn't contradict the basics of Rachel Reeves's agenda? And will she be the Chancellor to present such a statement if it was made?
Well, if we go through it backwards and who scored the goal, yes, she will still be Chancellor in May, I'm sure. The spring statement may well become something else, if not solely because we may have to announce very quickly an increase in defence spending, and that's got to come from somewhere. There is a point in politics where you have to say, right, either we plough along this unmade road that is looking increasingly muddy, impassable, and there's nowhere to turn around, or you stop and you say, okay, everybody get out, I'm going to try and reverse and get us back out onto the main road. And I think Rachel Reeves is at a point now where she's either got to bite the bullet and say, okay, I got it wrong. She doesn't have to use those words, but the increase in national insurance, you know, has hurt too many businesses, so we're going to raise the threshold, or we're going to exclude hospices and charities. You know, there are so many things that are not thought through properly. There's the farmers. Raise the threshold. Make it 3 million, 5 million. You'd still get your tax from your James Dysons and your Jeremy Clarksons, but you wouldn't be crippling the small farmers. You know, there are things that she could do if she'd got the imagination to do it. But what they haven't done, and where the government have failed so miserably, in my opinion, is there is nothing that they can point to say, look, this is happening in your area. All those new Labour MPs, what can they say to the people on the doorstep? 6 months on, nothing's changed. Everything's got more expensive. It's winter. Trump's in the White House, and we're potentially looking at war in Europe.
Can she do that, though? Can she make the changes, or is it such a repudiation of her strategy that it needs somebody else? And I mention that because there are whispers, and it could be mischievous whispers from the Tory press, that Keir Starmer is about to overrule her on this question of defence. And I mean, I'm not saying he's going to go to 5%, but that he wants to raise our defence expenditure for reasons that we discussed in the first part of this podcast by more than Rachel Reeves would be at all comfortable with.
Well, and I think that's absolutely fine. You know, in the end, you know, what is the government for? It is to protect the security of the country, and that is the Prime Minister's call. And he would have to overrule her in the same way as if we had, you know, God forbid, another pandemic or something like that that caused absolute catastrophe. He would have to override her. I don't, you know, there are also rumours that there's going to be a reshuffle coming up. I think, you know, if you're going to do a reshuffle, you've got to get it absolutely right. But I think Rachel Reeves, she's boxed herself into a corner, as you've pointed out. She is a product of the Treasury and Treasury thinking. She hasn't got the political antennae that would have said, hang on a minute, if you do this, this is going to happen. And where's the trade-off? So she hasn't got much wiggle room politically or economically. And the figures are very stubborn, and I don't see anything changing anytime soon.
Well, one of the things that I think is inhibiting growth is working from home. But we have discussed that before, so I don't want to bore people with it. But a little extra twist came this week with the revelation that there's a worrying growth in non-attendance by youngsters at school. And it was linked to parents who are working from home, I presume on the basis, well, if mummy and daddy aren't going to work, why do I need to go to school? Do you give any credence to that?
Yeah, I do, actually. And this was an interview with Sir Martin Oliver in the Sunday Times. He's the Chief Inspector of Ofsted. And the figures are absolutely staggering. It's a seventh of primary schools are now absent on a regular basis, and a quarter of secondary kids. And that's gone up from 13% in 2018, 2019 to the last year. So I think, personally, I'm getting a little bit weary of blaming everything on COVID for the reason that children can't read, don't know how to use a book, can't use the loo and all the rest of it. But there is no doubt that the confused messages of, right, you've got to do all your learning online. No, now you've got to stop, you've got to go into school. That is confusing. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that children need and respond to routine and discipline, and I don't mean that in a Miss Trunchbull sort of way. I mean the discipline of regular routine. You get up, you have breakfast, you put your school uniform on. Have you got your things ready for school, whether it's your gym kit or your guitar or whatever? It's mums and dads quite often work at home. There are lots and lots of jobs where people do work from home, and there are varying degrees of work, as we know. But I think it's that sense of you get up and you get ready and you go. And it may be down to parents, actually, right, this is it. This is our getting up time. I'm not sitting around in my pajamas having another cup of coffee and playing Scrabble on my computer. I am here to take you to school. Because the thing is, for teachers, they can't do it on their own. It has to be a team effort with parents. And if they've got kids not turning up for school and kids who think that school is optional, as parents who might go, yeah, I'm working from home, but actually I'm going to get my hair done this afternoon, or I'm going to meet so-and-so for a coffee. It's not good. It's not good for those children, and it's not good for schools. And it's not good for a future workforce either.
And indeed is the case, because, these youngsters will presumably emerge onto the employment market unable to get jobs, and it bodes very, very, very badly for the future. And certainly I think it contributes to this growth thing. I think more attention should be paid for it when Labour politicians are calling for growth, and you can see one or two of the problems. And we also agree that our non-membership of the European Union is an inhibitor of growth as well. But let's just finally turn to bright lights, and two bright lights. I think I'm afraid, agreed again, Joe, to the despair of our viewers and listeners on this subject. But this is an issue that apparently the government have set up a study into these very bright lights on cars, because increasingly cars have these LED lights as opposed to the softer halogen lights. But it's not just a question of the brightness of the lights, but it's also cars having automatic dippers which don't always work. And it's apparently contributing to 1 in 10 road accidents. So do you think, the government are looking into it, but of course that's always, sometimes it's a kiss of death because nothing ever happens. But do you really think that this is an issue they might take some action on?
Well, it's not for the government. It's actually for the car manufacturers. And I didn't realise, actually, because I don't have a car that's got automatic dipping. Mine you have to do manually. But they dip too late, particularly if you're on a country road, you're coming around a bend or something, and somebody's got their lights full on, and it's a good few seconds before you get the light on the oncoming car dim. So it's down to car manufacturers. It's interesting, actually, because I know there's been a lot of discussion about this, and people poo-poo it, and they say, oh, it's just you old people, you just think everything's bright, and we'll get a pair of those ridiculous yellow glasses that you look like a bumblebee and then you don't see the bright lights. And the car manufacturers were going, oh, no, we haven't made the lights brighter. They're just, as you say, LED lights. But this survey, I think it was from the RAC and the government, said actually it is now a big problem. The other thing, Jim, is that if it stops people going out, you know, whether they're older people or they're people who just don't particularly want to go driving, you know, for people who live in the countryside, people who are dependent on a car in the middle of winter at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, if you really don't feel safe because of the lights, that's actually quite a problem. And road safety is key. I mean, you know, one of the bonkers reasons that we change the clocks every 5 minutes is because of paper boys in Scotland or sheep farmers up a Welsh hillside. Well, this seems to me a really straightforward thing for road safety and cyclists and pedestrians and walkers. You know, just get it right. Get the car manufacturers to make the automatic things a bit quicker.
Joe, it's a delight to talk to you. You'll be preparing now for your next engagement with Mr. Farage on GB News.
Well, I hope you're talking about headlights, Jim. That's all I can say.
And we'll look forward to Frank's return next week. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Alice Evans was our producer today, and we'll see you again next week.